Welcome to the session, Opportunities in Global Trade. We would like to take a positive view on what is happening currently in the world from multiple perspectives. And we have invited two great speakers, Brent Melvin, CEO Gallega, a logistics provider to the automotive industry, and Tony Lugg, logistics and material management director, Asia Pacific at Lear Corporation, a leading supplier in the automotive industry. Welcome, gentlemen. Before we start the conversation, we would like to involve you, the audience, and ask for your view on where the opportunities come from. And please take a moment to make your votes and tell us where you see the drivers. Before we get to the results, I would like to ask the two speakers about one of the remarkable recent developments, which are the peace treaties in the Middle East. And Brent, you are living in the Middle East, you're operating from there, and therefore I would like to start with you. What is your take on the situation, and what is due to that in store potentially for the future?
Thank you firstly for the introduction, Wolfgang, and it's great to be part of the session. I think this is quite a milestone in the history, obviously, between these couple of nations. For the UAE, this really represents a tremendous opportunity, both in terms of trade with Israel as much as cross-trade with the rest of the world, utilizing Israel potentially as a gateway. So what it really means for us is obviously the opportunity now to exchange produce and goods. Obviously, technology, Israel has always set themselves as a leader and apart from many locations in the world as far as their advancements. And the same can apply to agri-tech and agricultural produce. So lots of opportunity for trading with them as a partner. And I think that from an international perspective, it opens great opportunities. And obviously, Tony, it would be great to get your perspective from an Asian side of things on how that looks.
Okay, Wolfgang, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the organization for inviting me to speak today. Look, this is an amazing opportunity. You know, Trump has not only secured peace in the countries just mentioned, but he's also talking about securing peace across the rest of the Middle East. So, you know, for Asia, I think that's going to open up significant market opportunities. We know from the Belt and Road initiative that there's rail already going up to Iran, so that, you know, that's going to open up the whole region. And that stabilization, I think that's going to open up new markets. In actual fact, I actually don't think organizations have actually realized the opportunity there. That stabilization of the whole region, just as Brent said, just opens up immense opportunities. So for automotive, look, it does mean that I think there are a lot of investment there. I think GDP will start to grow. People want to start buying their own cars. You know, we see a lot of second-hand market in that region, but now I think the opportunity is to actually ship in there and start selling, you know, to the general public.
Thank you very much, Tony. We are still waiting for the results, and therefore I would like to just double down on what you said, and like to ask you to share with the audience, just top of your mind, what do you think is needed to capture the opportunity from a company perspective? What should companies potentially do, or what can they do at that point to capture the opportunity ahead?
Well, I would have thought with this peace agreement, there are going to be incentives. And so immediately I would be looking at the incentives there to either, you know, start setting up plants. If you look at logistics, I think Brent can cover that area. But in terms of putting a whole infrastructure together, it's important to start building that infrastructure now. So we have that connectivity. And with that connectivity, it just opens up immense opportunities.
I think in addition to that, a key opportunity, of course, is you still have Saudi Arabia, who have not, at this particular point in time, signed a peace treaty, but it's imminent that that will happen. We all sit with good faith and hopes that this will in fact happen next number of months ahead of us. Now, when that happens, obviously you talk about stability in the region. That's a game changer. And when you look at it from a logistics perspective, you're also looking at tremendous land routes that are opening up that previously have been shut or having to run through some alternative channels. So it brings some great opportunities in this respect. Tony, again, as you suggested, the incentives, we haven't seen any such thing taking place at this point in time, but what we are seeing is already international delegations in both countries talking business. So there's been a tremendous push ahead of the signing, which took place yesterday, for companies to start collaborating in ideas. It was phenomenal to see how quickly we saw people on the ground in the UAE and how we've had delegations actually heading into Israel to start breaking down the borders. We know there are talks between airlines, so we'll quickly start seeing some air routes opening up. We will see a shortening of our routes between here and Europe by as much as probably 1 hour, because flight paths no longer have to circumvent Israel. We can now actually fly over their territories. So there are a lot of factors that will change some of the logistics dynamics, and we're excited about the next steps with potentially Saudi getting on board with this charter.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Tony. The results have come in. So this is a geopolitical topic. So 31% think that that's a driver of opportunities, and I think you laid that out. The top one driver is digitization. 60% believe in digitization. As I said, 31% in geopolitics. 4% in sustainability, and 4% in COVID. What is your reaction to those results? Maybe Brent, you want to start?
So I would say no surprise in terms of the digitization. I believe this is going to be a game changer as we continue forward. I think, again, I'm talking from a logistics specific perspective, but I think things like visibility, things like having complete control of your supply chain end to end, taking into account opportunities to do with robotics, with artificial intelligence. This is going to be a game changer for sure in the way that we operate within a logistics space. You look at supply and demand planning, you look at algorithms, supporting dual sourcing, or alternatively looking at inventory strategies. It's all going to be driven from a digitization perspective. We spoke a little bit earlier, and another factor that I think is going to be quite an emerging, interesting discussion point will be the e-commerce of automotive, particularly finished vehicles. We're seeing quite an uptake on that trend here. So again, the question is whether it's going to be downstream vehicle distributors and retailers that will play that part, or will we see it go upstream towards OEMs markets from an e-commerce perspective? And of course, the consumer maturity to take up those kind of models. Obviously, millennials drive this mentality. Touching on COVID, it's pushed very much into speeding up the trends in terms of digitization. Definitely no surprises. Obviously, from a geopolitical perspective, we're seeing a lot of tensions around the world, but we're seeing opportunities at the same time. And I think that it's how we play those tensions and opportunities to drive benefits.
Thank you very much, Brent. Tony, share your views on the outcome of the result.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised. Okay, I agree with Brent. The digitalization. Look, it's always been a key discussion recently. But I would have thought the geopolitical opportunity would have been bigger. And the reason, is one, obviously because of the Middle East. And look, I personally think, it's my own opinion, I personally think that, the trade war with China won't reignite. There's an election coming up, so there's a lot of hype around that election. Look, we saw what happened before. Trump negotiated a deal. The Chinese signed that deal. And look, unfortunately, COVID came along. But look, had that gone through, I think we would have seen those those markets opening up, and that trade between the two countries continue. Now, look, if you look at some of the drivers in terms of companies moving out of China, you have the Japan government offering, I think it was about 2.2 billion stimulus to companies wanting to move out of China. Korean companies were looking to basically move their manufacturing to India. Obviously, we had Trump's manufacture at home policy to create jobs in the US. And of course, look, even the EU were also looking at their reliance on the China supply chain or China manufacturing. So I would have expected the geopolitical issues to actually be higher. And then in terms of that geopolitical issues, when you look at the number of companies that are actually looking to leave China, hey, that opens up enormous opportunity for ASEAN and India. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more, Wolfgang. But in terms of digitalization, yeah, look, we should be now at the level where we can see piece level visibility, not just tracking the container or not tracking the airline. And look, there are platforms out there that can actually do that now. I did read an article recently that one supply chain officer said, look, my stress every day is not having the visibility of my inbound raw material. And to be honest, in 2020, if you haven't put that into your contracts and mandated that EDI with that traceability to make sure you have that in your flows, I think people have got to start going back and looking at those contracts and basically forcing that in. Now, look, in terms of sustainability at 4%, that's very disappointing. If you look at what's happened with COVID, if you look at what it's done in terms of exposing modern slavery, where workers from some countries were basically just, left out on the street, once the facility or the plant had closed down, that really just shows that there isn't enough focus being put on that. And then when we start looking at some of our environmental impacts, look, isn't this the time where we should now be doing the R&D on sustainability and really looking at, I would call it, the supply chain forensics. What are we doing in terms of the supply chain forensics in analyzing our whole network, our upstream suppliers, and actually going further upstream, not just having a contract that, we have with our tier one supplier. Hey, it's your responsibility to manage your own suppliers. We know that doesn't work. We know that the majority of people involved in modern slavery is actually in the supply chain, right? So what are organizations doing about that? I think this was the time, or this is the time, to actually start addressing those issues.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just a point on that, on sustainability. Sorry to cut you off, Wolfgang. I think, Tony, you don't you believe that sustainability was quite high on the agenda, but it's been kicked back somewhat due to COVID? So, I fully agree with the points that you're making, but somehow it seems to have been lost in the mix a little bit, with everybody having to refocus on the current issues at hand. As much as it's important, there are organizations that have represented very, very good CSR and sustainability programs, particularly towards slavery and such. But to me, this has been a little bit lost, and maybe something that needs to be re-energized as an industry to really take serious cognizance of it again.
Yeah, look, I think you're right, Brent. In many respects, look, COVID has exposed some major gaps in terms of our compliance. And look, my argument would be that if you had a sustainable organization, you should have should be coming out of COVID much stronger than what you did going into it. This should be part of your competitive edge. Now, the audit companies that I work with, and I work with all of the large brands, have all told me that there have been significant cutbacks in terms of sustainability. And I think we've got to be asking ourselves, why is that? Because if it's seen as a cost, then that's not, I would say that's not the best way to actually manage your business. I said there are some weaknesses there. Maybe, if we look at business continuity, we saw that business continuity was not being addressed within the boardroom. We saw that business continuity during COVID wasn't happening. We saw 63% of companies operating in China who took part in the survey actually admitted not having business continuity plans. So, when you start looking at sustainability, you wonder, well, who is the sustainability owner inside the boardroom? Who is actually owning the business continuity plan inside the boardroom? Because clearly what generally happens, these are outsourced to employees, either on the third or fourth tier of a level of management. So what does that mean? It means that there's no voice in the boardroom. There's no allocation in terms of resource, in terms of budgeting, etc. And of course, I think this is why these results are showing this.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better. Yep.
Thanks to both of you. Very interesting discussion, and I personally appreciate Tony's call for sustainability. Also keeping in mind that I think that the term sustainability is very much misunderstood. Sustainability is multi-dimensional. It includes, in fact, the economic dimension, durability of a business, including continuity, including the capabilities to respond. And then it has the environmental dimension, and it has the social dimension, which also came into the center stage with all the impact on people. What did we do to people, asking them to go home, spending days in front of their screen, which has its benefits, but it also has implications for leadership, and also for the HR policy and strategy going forward. So thank you. You already mentioned a lot of nuances in respect to the opportunities. What did you see in the last, from January on? We had a very turbulent year, right? The US-China situation continues. We spoke about the Middle East. We have COVID and all the economic consequences. But we talk about opportunities. Did you see that some companies really made a leap and captured it and positioned themselves differently and changed the competitive ranking?
We've seen quite a shift around here. Obviously, Middle East, I'm talking specifically UAE, responded very quickly to COVID. So we saw some very early lockdowns and action to control the spread of COVID. But at the same time, we also saw some very early easing of some of the, let's say, control rules. So we still have some strong guidance in place in terms of what we can and can't do, how we should do. But at the time, of course, there was, like every market, contraction. So in the automotive sector, we saw retail declining tremendously. Obviously, from a logistics point of view, it drives opportunity because that means storage. It means capacity loading and having to prepare for hopefully what is going to be an upsurge in consumer spending post-COVID. Now, we've seen that to some degree at the moment, but certainly nowhere near levels pre-COVID. So a lot of developments and changes going on. A lot of our neighbors like Saudi are still under pretty much lockdown. So land borders were the first thing to be closed, and only very recently have they opened up, and still with tremendous constraints around who can and can't carry freight across borders. We saw very little slowdown, by the way, in terms of sea freight and container traffic. So thankfully that still continued. We saw from a geopolitical perspective some interesting dynamics with the emission standards being implemented in China from the 1st of July. So that's had some implications for auto sales out of the Middle East. But by and large, I think there have been opportunities for companies that have been agile enough to adapt. You've seen a strong emergence of last mile and the importance of last mile, and of course, in fact, to the point, home delivery. So dynamics have shifted, but those that were ready to adapt to change could. Airlines, as we know, stopped flying very, very quickly, and the only thing that was being moved was relief aid. So looking at alternative methods of shipping, and coming out of it begs the question of what does logistics look like going forward? Because we talk about different strategies of making sure that you've got access to freight. You've got the nationalization taking place in many countries now, looking at nearshoring product, but again, wanting to go to markets internationally where manufacturing is still cheaper. So dynamics haven't fundamentally changed too much. The impact, of course, is there, and it's going to come out looking very different, we believe.
Brent, are you saying that the logistics sector as a whole is kind of, I avoid the word, but is relatively unaffected? On the contrary, had some, or is it affected? Do we have to see
it's
that?
Affected. Yeah, what it is, Wolfgang, is you've got different logistics providers providing different types of solutions are affected in different ways. So we are a multiple service provider. We look at warehousing, we look at storage, we look at transportation, and where we see shrinkage in certain areas because there's constraints, for example, in container movement or in airline uplift, we see benefits in other areas where there's a backlog, for example, in the retail sector. So cars have to be stored, there has to be maintenance of stock, these types of things. So you see a transition from one end to another. And I think there are many logistics companies that have suffered, but at the same time, those that have international networks, those that have big contracts, have found ways to support their customers by and large and getting freight to where it needs to be. I'll give you an example very simply is there was a contraction of available food stuff here in the UAE right in the beginning of the COVID crisis. And that was very apparent for all the companies that were doing home delivery. Suddenly what you're placing on order today was no longer available. And that's because the food supply chain was completely affected. The same can be said for pretty much any aspect of the supply chain. When you start looking at food, of course, it's a little more important to be able to feed people than it is to have a vehicle driving people around. So this is the kind of situation. So people were able to shift and move based on specific logistics silos. So that's my point, is people have suffered or gained based on the type of business they're in.
Thank you, Brent. Over to you, Tony.
So Wolfgang, look, I think some of the challenges are that in 2019, I think many of us thought we had our optimized supply chains and really look. I think the problem is going forward is how we're going to recover from this shock, because as we optimize the supply chain so much, it became highly sensitive to any shock waves. And of course, look, we saw this in Japan back in 2011 when we had the earthquake in Japan, and then of course where we had suppliers also in Thailand, we had that double whammy with the floods. So those companies involved in it were hit on the share price. Obviously, they lost revenue and they were impacted by their profits. And look, we haven't learned from that. And what you could actually say, it's either a laziness. I have an optimized supply chain, so I'm either lazy or I'm complacent. And lazy and complacent meaning that what did we do in terms of stress testing that supply chain? Because when I've done these supply chain forensic workshops, what they've actually done, not only has it made sure that I have a much stronger, more resilient, more robust supply chain, what it's actually done as well is given me cost saving opportunities. And I think the lack of that is a concern. that we all thought our supply chains were so solid. So it really has exposed that. And also, it's still disappointing that in 2020, chief supply chain officers are still not reporting to boardrooms. There's only a small amount that are actually reporting to the boardrooms, yet the cost of materials is significant inside of that organization. So, I think there's a lot of areas that need to be addressed in that. Now, look, going forward for next year, look, I think it means that we're going to have to really start looking at redesigning our supply chains for all the reasons that we've discussed already. I think we've got to be looking at how we can optimize them. How do we make them totally resilient without increasing our inventory and all of those issues? But generally, if we look at the iceberg model, 95% of all of the problems are hidden, which we're not actually addressing. We're not actually getting up there and dealing with those. So I think there's some significant opportunities going forward. We've spoken about some of them in terms of digitalization and things of that nature. So I think from those lessons learned, we should have a clear roadmap on what we need to do to make sure we're sustainable going forward.
Thank you, Tony. We have 3 minutes left, and the session is called Opportunities in Global Trade. And we have, of course, spoken in the context of global trade. And we don't have a crystal ball, but how do you see global trade going forward, global trade 2021? Just a guess you may wish to share. And Tony, do you want to start?
Wolfgang, I would say that this is the land of opportunity. This is the chance now to start looking at all of the tariffs. We have Brexit deals going through now. We have the US obviously negotiating. And of course, look, once those companies move from China, and it's not just because of the political pressure, hey, there's been a lot of companies moving from China because of where they're chasing labor costs, okay, or the land costs and things of that nature. So what are the new tariffs going to be? Where are those incentives going to be? So those are some of the things I would be looking for in terms of global trade, and actually doing those total cost of operation studies or a total landed cost study.
Very quick follow-up question. Today I read about Colombia. Colombia is also gaining trade, exports more than ever. Do you see, and it's been particular to the US, do you see more regional trade?
I would suggest yes, definitely. If you look at the agreements, obviously South America wants to sell into the US, so I would say yes.
Thank you. Brent, your take?
Similar to Tony's, I think it is an opportunity market right now. For sure, there's going to be some developing trends. We have to watch the geopolitical space very, very closely. It's going to dictate what happens in the near future. You can see policies coming out of the US related to manufacturing and trying to encourage manufacturing back in US. You see places like the UAE promoting heavily manufacturing here. That's something somebody wouldn't have thought about in the near past. But actually, under the COVID climate, there are potentially great opportunities for that to happen. And it's, again, a realignment of some of the supply chain strategies. What do you place where, and how do you reach the world from certain markets? And I think it is a prerequisite for supply chain managers to relook at their total networks, understand how they reach their markets in a far more effective manner. So it's about placement, it's about cost, and it's about, to Tony's point exactly, what is the cost per unit landed, and is that effective for the organization? So great opportunities ahead of us.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time is up. Thanks to the audience for joining this conversation. From my perspective, very, very insightful. And despite all the things we have to deal with, all the challenges, there are opportunities ahead. Thank you very much.
Agree. Thank you. Thank you, Wolfgang.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate
Brent.
it. Take care. Thank you, Tony and Wolfgang. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.